Puppy cried next to his dead mother, begging her to come back. When rescuers discover the truth behind it, they fall to the ground and start crying desperately. Have you ever heard a cry so desperate that it seems to pierce your soul? That fragile, insistent sound that echoes in the night and carries an invisible weight, as if it were a silent cry for help that no one can ignore. Now, imagine this sound cutting through the silence of a deserted street on a cold night, where the fine rain draws. Small rivers across the asphalt and the wind howls through the alleys. The scene seems empty, but there is something there, something that moves with difficulty, something that refuses to accept abandonment. In the middle of the wet asphalt, where the cold of the night mixes with the weight of abandonment, a small puppy cowers, trembling, its muscles tense as if trying to contain the pain that runs through its fragile little body. Its tiny paws, soaked by the rain, can barely support its weight, as if all the energy it once had is slipping away along with hope. The icy wind blows relentlessly, ruffling his thin, shaggy fur, but he doesn't move. He can't move. He's there, nestled against something that should be warm, that should protect him, but is now nothing more than a lifeless shadow. His mother, his only refuge, is lying next to him, motionless, cold, silent. The body that previously molded itself to his, welcoming and protective, now seems rigid and distant, as if it no longer belonged to that world. But he refuses to accept this. His little eyes, too big for his thin face, shine with confusion and despair. He doesn't understand. He doesn't understand why his mother doesn't move, why she doesn't respond when he cries, why her smell, once so familiar and comforting, now carries a different weight, something strange and scary. His wet nose touches her belly, pokes lightly, then harder. He gives little licks, like he did when he wanted attention, when he wanted affection. But nothing happens. A hoarse moan escapes your throat, a mix of fear and pleading. He crawls closer, trying to curl up against her belly, trying to find there the warmth that was always there, the warmth that always made him a safe cub. But the heat is gone, and in its place just a cold, terrifying silence. The rain presses down, hitting the asphalt in small explosions of water. The cub pushes its mother with its head, again and again, insistent, as if the simple touch could bring her back. But the truth, cruel and inevitable, remains. Her body doesn't respond. The chest does not rise or fall. The heart that once beat loudly next to yours is now quiet. He cries, a small, weak sound, almost swallowed by the sound of the rain. It's the only sound he can make, the only one he knows how to make, a desperate lament, a last attempt to bring back what he lost without even understanding how. But the world doesn't respond. The street remains empty, and he remains there, small, trembling, trying to find warmth where there is no more life. The rain is heavy. The drops run down the puppy's dirty, sodden fur, making his small body even heavier. The cold penetrates his bones, and tiredness threatens to overwhelm him. But he fights. He can't sleep. Sleeping means giving up, and he can't do that. There is still something inside him that keeps him there, resisting, fighting against the cruel fate that was imposed on him. But what happened here? How did this fragile little being end up alone in the middle of a deserted street, clinging to a love that is now gone? This puppy's story is one that breaks the heart, a story that no one should have to live, but that unfortunately happens every day, far from the eyes and reach of human compassion. The crying continues. It is not just a cry of hunger or cold, it's a desperate call to a world that has ignored it. Time passes, and he doesn't give up. He calls and calls, as if his insistence could bring his mother back, as if the simple fact of not stopping crying could undo what had already been done. But the silence around you is cruel. A car's headlights cut through the darkness in the distance. The tires slide on the wet road, but no one seems to notice the small body curled up next to the inert corpse. The engines roar. The hurried footsteps of the few pedestrians echo, but no one stops. The puppy is invisible to the world. Its pain is not heard. Its suffering is just one of many. Then a shadow approaches. Slow, cautious steps. Someone heard. Someone stopped. And that person for a moment hesitates, because when faced with that scene, the heart tightens, the throat closes, and a knot of indignation and sadness forms. How could anyone allow this to happen? How could such a small and defenseless being be thrown into the world like this? The puppy senses the presence and shrinks back, scared. He doesn't know who to trust anymore. His last memories are of fear and abandonment, but at the same time, his hope is stubborn. His little eyes shine for a moment, trying to find something there that he has seen before, something that his mother gave him until her last breath. Love. What will happen now? This little warrior finally found someone who cared, or would life have more trials in store for him? The answer will come, but until then the puppy remains there. Small, fragile, resisting, because even without understanding the world, he knows that giving up was never an option. No puppy should have to go through this, but this is the reality for many. If you believe that no animal deserves to be abandoned, comment, "You are not alone," in the comments. This shows that there is still compassion in the world. And subscribe to the channel and leave a like so this story reaches as many people as possible and they understand that animals deserve love and care. What makes someone do this? This is the question that repeats itself in the minds of so many people who dedicate their lives to saving those who have no voice. Each story of abandonment and mistreatment brings with it a different weight, a tightness in the chest that never completely disappears. But some stories are worse. Some stories don't just hurt, they tear. And this was one of them. The report arrived late in the afternoon when the rain was beginning to let up. A resident who passed the same street every day on her way home noticed something strange. A small puppy, alone, in the middle of the wet asphalt. First he thought he was lost, but when he got closer he felt a shiver run through his body. The cub wasn't just there. He was desperately trying to wake up what appeared to be his mother. She didn't have the courage to approach. He immediately called a group of volunteers he knew, those who were always ready to help the forgotten animals, the rejected ones, the ones who were left behind as if they were nothing. When he answered the call, one of the volunteers asked the only thing that really mattered. "Are they still alive?" The woman hesitated. "The puppy does. But his mother?" The silence on the other end of the line confirmed what he already feared. The team didn't take long to arrive. The car parked a few meters earlier, and before they even got out, they could already see the small body curled up next to the larger one. It was a difficult scene to process. The road still shone under the city lights, reflected off the wet asphalt, and the night's chill made steam rise from the volunteers' mouths as they approached. But the world around didn't seem to notice. Cars passed by, hurried footsteps echoed on the sidewalk, as if that little piece of pain didn't exist for anyone but them. The cub barely noticed the group's arrival. He no longer had the energy to be scared. His strength now focused solely on that futile attempt to wake his mother. He pushed with his nose, whimpered softly, as if he was trying not to bother her too much, but at the same time, begging her to come back. His body was so small and thin that it was difficult to believe he was still alive. One of the volunteers knelt down next to him and touched the dog's head as gently as possible. The fur, once soft, was now rough, full of dirt and hardened by time on the streets. But it was upon closer inspection that the true horror revealed itself. The thin skin left the bones of his body visible, betraying a long history of hunger, protruding ribs, fragile paws, a thinness that went beyond abandonment. It was as if she had fought until the last moment, giving the puppy everything she had, until there was nothing left for herself. But the bruises told an even crueler story. There were dark marks along his back, old wounds mixed with newer ones. Her muzzle had small cuts, as if she had been kicked, scratched, hurt in so many ways that it was impossible to say how many times she had suffered before her body finally gave up. The volunteers' eyes met for a moment, and no one needed to say anything. They had already seen a lot, but this was different. This was brutal. This was unacceptable. The cub looked up, and at that moment, the volunteer felt something he had never felt before. It wasn't just a look of fear or pain. It was a look of despair, as if that little creature was asking for help, begging them to fix something that could no longer be fixed, as if he knew that the one thing that could bring him back to the safety of life was no longer there. But he still didn't want to accept it. When the caring arms lifted him off the ground, he struggled. His thin, weak body struggled as if his life depended on it. He didn't want to be taken. He wanted to stay. I wanted to wait. I wanted to try one more time. He let out a low growl, followed by a piercing cry that made everyone around hold their breath. The volunteer held on tight, trying to convey calm, "I know, little one. I know." But the puppy didn't know. He didn't understand that his mother wouldn't come back. And how? Do you explain this to someone who has only known her love? The streets continued indifferently. The world was spinning without noticing the loss that puppy had just suffered. But at that moment, for those volunteers, nothing else mattered. They held him carefully, wrapped in a warm blanket. And as they walked away, one of the volunteers remained kneeling for a moment next to the dog, in silence, as if paying one last respect. Because she wasn't just another street dog, she was a mother, and he had fought to the end for his son. Now the only thing left for them was to ensure that her sacrifice was not in vain. What does a puppy feel when it loses its mother? For those who have never seen this scene up close, it may be difficult to imagine. But anyone who has ever rescued a dog that went through this knows that it's not just about fear or sadness. It's something deeper, something that tears the soul. It's not just the loss of a bond, it's the loss of the entire meaning of existence. Because for such a small cub, his mother wasn't just his protector, she was his entire world. And that's exactly what the volunteers noticed when they approached that little, soaked and trembling being. He was there, surrounded by cold and loneliness, but he still clung to the only fragment of love he had left. Her little body, thin and fragile, curved against the lifeless dog, seeking from her a warmth that no longer existed. The fine rain continued to fall, and each drop that ran down the asphalt seemed to count the seconds that passed without him accepting reality. His eyes, big and scared, were fixed on her. The mother who had always been there, always responded to the slightest of his cries, always cuddled his small body against hers to protect him from the cold, was now motionless, and the puppy couldn't understand. He tried once more. With his nose, he pushed her body, first lightly, then with more force. I didn't understand why she didn't move, why she didn't welcome him back, why she didn't shake herself to get rid of that dirt that stuck to her fur. So he tried another way. He got closer and licked her face, repeating the gesture he had done so many times to get her attention. But she was still there, rigid, silent. A small moan escaped her throat, a low, hoarse sound that seemed to carry within it a cry for help that no one in the world could answer. Their little eyes shone with the reflection of the city lights, but there was no hope in them, just confusion, just despair. The volunteers who watched everything in silence felt a tightness in their chests. As much as they had already seen sad stories, nothing prepared them for the pain of a puppy that still didn't understand that it had lost its mother forever. It was necessary to get him out of there. There was nothing more to be done for that dog who, until her last moment, probably fought to protect that puppy. But for him, there was still a chance. There was still hope. One of the volunteers slowly bent down and extended his hand. But as soon as it felt approaching, the cub retreated. His small body shrank even more, as if he wanted to become invisible, as if he was afraid that someone would take him away from that moment, from that last connection with his mother. The volunteer tried again, moving slowly with all the patience in the world, murmuring calm words, but the puppy's reaction was immediate. He growled, an almost insignificant sound, but it carried all the fear and fragility of someone who no longer knew who to trust. He didn't want to be touched. He didn't want to be taken. He wanted to stay there, because there, even if her mother no longer moved, there was still something of her. There was still her scent. There was still her body, and in the cub's mind that meant she was still there. He didn't know that if he stayed, he would be doomed. I didn't know that cold, hunger, and abandonment were cruel enemies that showed no mercy to anyone. All he knew was that if he allowed those hands to push him away, he would lose the last bit of what gave him security. But the volunteers knew. They knew they couldn't leave him there, no matter how much he resisted. Time was running out, and they needed to earn his trust before it was too late. Some questions simply cannot go unanswered, and while the cub was still struggling with the idea of moving away from its mother, a doubt began to grow among the volunteers. What happened here? What led that bitch to this cruel fate? And how did that cub, so small and defenseless, survive until now? The night was still cold, and the wind cut through the volunteers' clothes as they tried to gain the little dog's trust. He resisted, trembled, growled softly, but deep down, he was already without strength. When they finally picked him up, his fragile little body shrank, as if he feared being ripped away from the only connection he still had with his mother. His eyes looked around at every detail, memorizing every piece of that sad scene as if he knew he would never return there again. They needed to get him out of there. He needed a safe place, warmth, food. But as they were preparing to leave, one of the volunteers, who had stepped back a little to look around, suddenly stopped. Something caught his attention. High up in a neighboring building, discreetly positioned over a side door, a security camera flashed a small red light. The volunteer looked at his colleagues and pointed. Someone may have seen what happened. Someone may have registered it. It was a disturbing thought. If that camera worked, then there was a chance the truth was out there, waiting to be discovered. One of the volunteers made a mental note of the name of the establishment and decided that they would return the next day to try to access the images. But for now, they needed to focus on the puppy. He was still in shock, his body tense, his little eyes fixed on his mother who was left behind. Her moans were almost inaudible now, as if her voice was fading along with the hope that everything would return to normal. It was at that moment, when they were about to walk away, that something on the ground made one of the volunteers stop. A small object, half hidden in the dirt right next to the dog's body. He bent down to pick it up, and when he turned his palm over, what he saw made his stomach turn. It was a toy, an old, torn, mud-stained toy. A teddy bear that once may have been white, but was now almost unrecognizable. One of the eyes was missing and the stitching was coming apart in places, as if it had been carried for a long time, bitten, dragged along the ground. But despite the deplorable state, it was still possible to see it for what it was, someone's treasure. And then, something unexpected happened. The puppy, which until then had been motionless in the volunteer's arms, began to struggle frantically. He saw the toy. His entire body went into a state of alert, as if every survival instinct was screaming inside him at the same time. He whimpered, stretched his paws towards the object, tried to free himself from the hands that were holding him. His eyes were wide, desperate. He recognized that toy. The volunteer did not hesitate. He knelt on the ground and placed the teddy bear right in front of the cub, who immediately grabbed it in his mouth, squeezing it between his teeth as if his life depended on it. He was shaking even more now, but his crying was different. It wasn't just sadness. It was despair. But what did this object mean? The volunteers looked at each other, not knowing exactly how to interpret that reaction. The puppy was attached to that toy as if it were the most precious thing in the world, as if, somehow, that dirty piece of fabric was a piece of something he never wanted to lose again. Then the penny dropped. That toy wasn't there by chance. Maybe it was a gift, something someone gave to him or his mother before everything fell apart. Or maybe it was the only thing left of a place where they were once happy, or even worse. Maybe that teddy bear was thrown with them as a cruel reminder that they once belonged to someone, but now they no longer did. The puppy clutched the toy against him, breathing rapidly, as if that old piece of cloth was the only anchor holding him steady in a world that had suddenly become too cruel for him to understand. The volunteers felt a lump in their throat. What else could that security camera reveal? They didn't know it yet, but one thing was certain. That story was far from over. What happens when a cub loses not only its mother, but also any reason to carry on? The survival instinct should keep you fighting, should make you react. But some dogs, especially those marked by abandonment and fear, cannot find the strength to continue. They give up, not because they want to, but because they don't know how to live without what they lost. And that was exactly what the volunteers feared when observing that little being in the shelter. From the moment he arrived, the puppy was no longer the same. If before he cried and tried to wake up his mother, now he simply did nothing. His large, frightened eyes, which had previously scanned the room for an answer, were now empty. He didn't explore the new space. He didn't show curiosity about the other rescued dogs. It didn't even react to the volunteers' careful touch. He just stayed there, curled up in a corner of the kennel, with that dirty little toy between his paws. I didn't eat, didn't sleep. I didn't look at anyone. It was as if his body was there, but his mind was left behind, in the wet street, next to his mother's lifeless body, as if he somehow believed that if he waited long enough, she would come back. The caregivers tried everything. They left food next to him, but the plate remained untouched. They would try to grab the toy for a moment, to see if it would react, but as soon as someone approached, it would pull it close, growling. Softly, in a defense that was barely sustained. It was the only thing he still had, the only link to the past. The nights were even more difficult. The shelter was silent, only the sound of heavy breathing and occasional barking echoing through the space. But the puppy didn't sleep. He just stood there, eyes fixed on the toy, as if he expected that at any moment something would change, as if he believed that if he stayed awake long enough, his mother would come back for him. The volunteers were worried. They knew that dogs could die from sadness. They had seen this before. Some simply refused to continue when they lost everything. And that cub, he seemed to be heading down the same path. Attempts to get closer were always frustrated. When someone knelt down next to him and tried to talk, he just lowered his head as if they weren't there. When they tried to offer more appetizing snacks, he didn't even smell them. His small body was becoming even more fragile, every day thinner, every day more abandoned to a void that no one could fill. Hope began to dissipate among the caregivers, because as much as they had rescued that cub from the cold and hunger, they couldn't rescue him from his own pain. But they wouldn't give up, because if there was a chance, no matter how small, they were willing to fight for it, even if the cub himself could no longer fight for himself. And deep down, everyone knew. If something didn't change soon, he simply wouldn't survive. Some questions are too difficult to ignore. From the moment they found that cub curled up next to its mother's lifeless body, the volunteers knew something was wrong. The dog's condition, her extreme thinness, the signs of abuse. Nothing about it seemed like a simple case of abandonment. There was cruelty there. There was something much worse than just oblivion. But the answer to that story was hidden. The cub couldn't tell what happened. He couldn't explain why he held that dirty little toy like it was the most important thing in the world. All he could do was wait, waiting for something that would never come back. And that's why, the morning after the rescue, the volunteers returned to the street where it all happened. They knew there was a camera there, strategically positioned over the door of a small market. If it had been working, perhaps it would have recorded the exact moment that Mother and her cub were thrown onto that deserted street, as if they were nothing more than trash. When they arrived at the place, the market owner received them with suspicion. He had already seen so many things happen in that region. I knew people abandoned dogs all the time, but when the volunteers explained the scene they encountered the night before, their countenance changed. He took them inside and accessed the camera footage without hesitation. The next few minutes were absolute silence. On the computer screen, black and white images showed a dark, wet street. It was around 3 in the morning. Everything was quiet, just the dim light of a streetlight illuminating part of the sidewalk. Then a car appears, an old, dirty vehicle, headlights off, moving slowly, as if the driver wanted to avoid attracting attention. He parks near the sidewalk, and for a few seconds nothing happens. Then the passenger door opens. A man comes out. He doesn't seem to hesitate. His actions are quick, almost mechanical, as if I had already done this before, as if it meant nothing to him. He's holding something, a bag. Volunteers hold their breath as they watch. The man carries that bag as if it were a heavy burden and walks to the sidewalk. It is at this moment that the image becomes clearer. It wasn't just any bag. It was a cloth bag, and inside it, something was moving. And then, without any remorse, he simply throws the bag on the floor. Inside were the dog and the puppy. The dog doesn't move right away. For a second, the volunteers try to hold on to the hope that maybe, at that moment, she was still alive. But the man doesn't stay to see. He turns around, goes back to the car, and something even worse happens. Before entering the vehicle, he does something unthinkable. He reaches into the bag and pulls the cub out. The small body, weak and defenseless, struggles for a moment, but he doesn't have the strength to react. He just cries, a high-pitched, desperate sound that the camera can't capture but that the volunteers can almost hear in their minds. And then, as if his cruelty wasn't enough, the man takes him with him. The car takes off, disappearing into the darkness of the street, taking the puppy to an unknown destination. And in that moment, the volunteers understand. The cub was not abandoned next to its mother that night. He went back there. Somehow, after being taken, after being separated from the only thing he knew as home, he found his way back. But when it arrived, it was already too late. Images are paused. The silence in the market is heavy. Nobody says anything for a while, because there are no words that can describe what they just saw. The man who threw those two there was still out there. He was somewhere. It still existed. And now, They had to find out who he was. Some questions are too difficult to ignore. The cub's rescue had already been a shock, but now, faced with the security camera images, the volunteers felt they were facing something even more disturbing. They had found the cub curled up next to its mother's lifeless body, desperately trying to wake her up, as if there was still some hope. But the images showed an even worse truth. He had not been abandoned there that night. It was taken away. The man who appeared in the recordings arrived driving an old car, moving in the darkness as if to avoid being noticed. He was carrying a bag containing the dog and the puppy. He threw his mother to the ground as if she were a bag of trash, without hesitation, without looking back. But what happened next was the scariest. He didn't leave the puppy with her. He didn't allow him to stay by the side of those who always protected him. Instead, he grabbed the small, defenseless body and carried it away. And that's when the real mystery began. If the puppy was taken, how did it get back? That was the question no one could answer. He was too small to travel long distances alone. He had no strength. He was weak, malnourished. But somehow, after he was ripped away from his mother, he found his way back. And when it arrived, it was already late. The rescue team knew they couldn't just accept this story without answers. They needed to understand. They needed to find out who that man was, what he did with the puppy after taking it, and most importantly, how that little dog managed to return. The first step was to discover the origin of the car. They paused the images when the vehicle became more visible and tried to identify the license plate. But the recording wasn't clear enough. The numbers were blurred, and all they could see was one detail: a dent on the side near the passenger door. This meant that this car wouldn't go unnoticed so easily. Someone, somewhere, must have seen that vehicle before. The second step was to understand why someone would do something like this. Animal abandonment was nothing new for the volunteers. Everyday dogs were left behind by people who should never have had an animal in the first place. But this case was different. There was something cold and calculating in that man's gestures. He didn't just get rid of the dog, he chose to take the puppy. And what scared the most was the possibility that he wasn't alone. What did he want with the cub? Why, after taking him, was the cub able to escape, or was he left behind? Volunteers started asking around. They showed images of the car, described the scene, tried to find any clues as to who could have done this, but the answers were always the same. Nobody recognized the vehicle. Nobody had seen anything, but it was. When they started talking to residents further away from the region, that information caught their attention. A lady who lived next to a dirt road leading out of town mentioned that she had seen a car like this before. He didn't remember exactly when, but he knew that the dent on the side looked familiar. She said a few nights ago she heard barking coming from outside her house, weak barking, as if a dog was asking for help. But when he went out to look, he found nothing, just the silence of the early morning and some tire tracks in the mud. This meant that the cub may have been left in that region. Or worse, he may have escaped something much scarier. The volunteers decided to head in that direction. Fear grew within them. They knew they were dealing with something bigger than a simple case of abandonment, but they needed to continue. Because if that cub managed to find its way back to its mother, it was because it had escaped from something that no one yet understood. And the truth, when it was discovered, could be much crueler than they imagined. Some truths are difficult to accept. When the volunteers began to investigate who the man was, who appeared in the recording throwing the dog into the street and taking the puppy with him, they already knew they would find something terrible. But nothing prepared them for what they discovered. With the image of the car in hand, they spent days asking around in workshops, gas stations, any place where that vehicle might have been noticed. It was a frustrating search, full of vague answers and suspicious looks, until they finally had a breakthrough. A gas station attendant recognized the car. I didn't remember the driver exactly, but I knew that vehicle always appeared there, usually late at night. He didn't know the owner's name, but there was one important detail. The last time he saw him, the car was dirty, covered in dust and mud, as if it had driven on a dirt road. This led them to a new clue, a small dirt road. Almost forgotten, that led to an area further away from the city. By asking the few residents of that region, the volunteers finally got an address, an isolated house hidden behind dry trees and a rusty gate. When they arrived, something immediately felt wrong. The place exuded abandonment, but it was no ordinary abandonment. There was life there. The strong animal smell was impossible to ignore, but it wasn't a normal smell from a home where dogs are well cared for. It was a dense, suffocating smell of accumulated dirt, of despair. The yard was full of chains, some attached to rusty poles, others lying on the ground as if they had recently been used. Old bowls, some still containing the remains of spoiled food, were scattered near the entrance to the house. And then the sound came, barking, not from one but from several dogs. Some strong, aggressive, others shorter, whining. But the most disturbing thing was that none of them were in sight. Before even knocking on the door, the volunteers decided to ask the neighbors about the man, and it was at that moment that the truth began to take shape. The people around knew who he was. Some avoided speaking, perhaps out of fear, but an older man who lived next door revealed what no one wanted to say out loud. That man raised dogs, not for love, not because I liked them, but because I saw them as merchandise. He sold puppies. I'd been doing this for years. He raised dogs in terrible conditions, without care, without vaccinations, without affection, and when a bitch was no longer useful, when she became old, sick, unable to bear any more puppies, he simply got rid of her. The silence among the volunteers was heavy. The air felt colder. They already knew they were dealing with a case of cruel abandonment, but this was worse. This was premeditated. This was a cycle. And then, the final blow. The cub and its mother were part of this scheme. That dog who died alone on the cold sidewalk had already been forced to bear puppies for a long time. Her weakened body, her visible ribs, the marks of abuse, everything indicated that she was no longer fit for that man's purpose. So he did what he always did, got rid of her. But the puppy, he wasn't supposed to go along. It was probably still new enough to be sold. It was still valuable to that man. That's why, when he threw the mother out on the street, he took the baby back. But something happened that night. Something no one expected. The puppy ran away. Somehow that little being, so fragile and defenseless, escaped that hell and went in search of the only thing that still made sense to him. He followed his mother's scent. He walked for miles alone in the cold, not knowing where he was going, just trusting his instinct, his memory of what was safe, the last bond he still had. And when it arrived, she was no longer there to protect him. That cub, which the volunteers found trying to wake up its mother's lifeless body, had not been abandoned. There, he came back. He struggled to find her, but he found only emptiness. The lump in each volunteer's throat tightened. That story wasn't just about abandonment. It was about loyalty, about a love that went beyond the limits of pain. That cub hadn't given up on its mother, and now the volunteers wouldn't give up on him either. But first they needed to face that man. They needed to ensure that no more dogs would go through that. What was about to happen would change everything. Some people can look into an animal's eyes and see love, loyalty, and a pure soul. Others see just an object, something disposable, something that can be exploited until it is no longer useful. And few things are scarier than realizing that these types of people live all around us, hidden behind rusty gates and high walls, committing acts that no one imagines. The volunteers knew they were about to face someone like this. They knew it wouldn't be easy. But when you fight for those who don't have a voice, fear is just a detail. They called the police before heading to that place. They didn't know what they would find, but they were already sure that they weren't dealing with a simple case of abandonment. What had happened to that dog and her puppy was just a piece of something bigger, something that needed to be stopped. And more than anything, they felt that there were still dogs in there, living in that house like invisible prisoners. The police car stopped in front of the rusty gate. The volunteers were close behind. The wind swayed the dry trees around, and an uncomfortable silence hung in the air. Then a sound broke this false calm. Barking. Lots of barking. Several dogs of different sizes and voices barked inside that house as if they knew something was about to happen, as if they were calling for help. The police knocked on the door. The noise echoed loudly. For a few seconds, no one responded. A second, stronger blow made the old structure shake. That's when they heard shuffling footsteps on the other side. The door opened. The man from the recordings was there. He wasn't especially intimidating. He didn't look like a criminal that we usually imagine. He seemed ordinary, the kind of person no one would notice walking down the street. But his eyes, there was something wrong there, something cold, something that didn't fit with the fact that behind him, dozens of innocent lives were trapped in suffering. He looked at the police officers and the volunteers, showing no surprise, as if he already knew why they were there, as if I had already expected that. What it was. His voice was dry, impatient. The police showed the security camera footage. They asked about the dog, about the puppy. He shook his head and let out a short, mocking laugh. I don't know what they're talking about. It must have been someone else. The answer was obvious. The same one that so many give when they are cornered. But the volunteers had already seen enough signs. They didn't need his confession to know who he was. One of the officers looked into the yard. That's when everything started to fall apart. The smell was the first thing that hit anyone who paid attention. A sour smell, a mixture of dirt, abandonment and despair. The smell of a place where lives were reduced to nothing. And then the details began to emerge. Chains, some still attached to stakes in the ground, others lying around, as if they had recently been used. Pots of water, but the water was greenish, untouchable. Bowls with rotting food remains. Bones scattered about, some too small to be just leftover food. And the barking got louder. The volunteers advanced to the side gate of the house, and from inside they could see. They were there. The dogs that were still alive. There were at least 6. Some cowered in the corner, thin, scared, their tails between their legs. Others still had the strength to growl, bark, protest against years of neglect and pain. But what hurt most was seeing those who had already given up, those who just looked with empty eyes, as if they had already understood that there was nothing more to them than that. The volunteers felt their chests tighten. They needed to get out of there. They needed to be taken to a place where they could be treated, where they could relearn how to trust. But first, there was something that needed to be done. The man realized he had lost. They're not mine, he said, crossing his arms. They appeared here. I just tried to help. Another lie, another futile attempt to escape something that was already present in every corner of that yard. But it was no use anymore. The police advanced. The house was searched. More chains, more signs that this place had been a storehouse of pain for years, more pieces of a story that no one should live. The man was taken. The dogs were released. And, as they were rescued, one by one, the cub, the one who had run away and found his mother lifeless on the sidewalk, watched. Everything from afar. Still scared, still small, but for the first time, surrounded by people who would never allow him to go through something like that again. The volunteers knew there was still a long way to go. Those dogs would need treatment, patience, love. Some perhaps would never completely trust humans again, but at least now they had a chance. And it all started with that little puppy. The one who survived, the one who got away, the one who, even without understanding, was the one who brought the truth to light. Not every truth should be revealed at once. Some need to be discovered little by little because they are too cruel to be absorbed immediately. Rescuing the dogs in that filthy backyard had already been a victory, but the story behind those chains, the rotten food, the thin and scared bodies, was still incomplete. And as the volunteers continued their search for answers, they realized there was something even darker hiding in that house. Something that no one wanted to say out loud, but that hung in the air like a ghost. The rescued dogs were receiving care. Some still trembled at the slightest sudden movement. Others refused to eat, as if they were afraid that the food would be taken away from them at any moment. There were deep marks on them, not only on the body but also on the soul. But the cub, the one that survived, the one that ran away to find its mother, seemed to carry an even greater burden. He didn't mix with others. He didn't show relief at being safe. He just held his dirty and torn toy between his paws, as if he were still stuck in a past that no one could reach. Volunteers needed to know the truth. It was by talking to the people around the house where the man was arrested that they began to understand the horror that the puppy had faced before being found. Not everyone wanted to talk. Some neighbors just shook their heads and closed the door. Others said they already knew something terrible was happening there, but never had the courage to report it. Fear? Indifference? Maybe a little of both. But it was one of the older residents, a man with slow steps and a tired look, who finally gave the answers they were looking for. He didn't know the dog's name, but I knew she had been there for years. Always pregnant, always thin, always with that look of someone who has already lost everything, except the instinct to protect their own. Her barks echoed through the neighborhood each time her puppies were taken. Away each time a new dog arrived to take the other's place. But in recent months something has changed. She was weaker, and weak dogs were no longer fit for that place. The man's voice broke when he told what he knew. He had no proof, but he had heard conversations, whispers from employees who came and went from that house. Weak puppies, puppies that were born too small, that took a long time to open their eyes, that didn't have the strength to fight for food. These didn't live there long. They were discarded, in the worst possible way. The volunteers gulped. The little cub they found crying next to its mother's body should not have been alive. He was one of the weak ones. It would not be fit to be sold. He should have been discarded, but it wasn't. His mother didn't allow it. Somehow, even though he had no strength, even though he knew he couldn't fight it, that bitch tried to protect him. He must have hidden, he must have growled, he must have fought as hard as he could. But no, one there cared about that, and that's why she was beaten. You said that in the last week before she disappeared you heard the screams. It wasn't just barking, it was screaming. Something no one forgets after hearing it. And after that, silence. That terrible silence that only happens when something really bad has already happened. She survived for a while, but her fate was already sealed. And the puppy? He survived by chance, or by fate. Perhaps because he was too small, he managed to escape without being noticed. Maybe he was thrown aside, forgotten in a corner until he managed to escape. Or perhaps, through one last act of courage, his mother managed to hide him, protect him until the last moment. But none of that changed the fact that he went through hell before he even opened his eyes to the world. The volunteers looked at him now, in the shelter, holding that dirty old toy. A little survivor who didn't know he had escaped something much worse than abandonment. And it was there that they realized that rescuing him wouldn't just mean feeding and caring. He needed something bigger. He needed to relearn how to trust. And more than anything, I needed to know that I would never be alone again. Some wounds are not visible. Some pain cannot be cured with medicine or food. The cub was safe now. He was far from the cold, the chains, the suffocating smell of fear that permeated the place he came from. But still, he didn't seem to really be there. His body was present, but his mind seemed trapped in a place no one could reach. Since arriving at the shelter, he simply existed. He didn't play, he didn't explore, he didn't show curiosity about the surrounding environment. If someone approached, he would just shrink his paws, becoming even smaller, as if he wanted to disappear. But what worried the volunteers most was the look. It wasn't a scared look, like a dog that has suffered and is now afraid of being hurt again. It was an empty look, lifeless. He didn't eat alone. He didn't react when other dogs ran around the space. He didn't respond when someone tried to offer him affection. But every night, when the shelter fell silent and the lights went out, he always did the same thing. He sat facing the door, and he stayed there, motionless, hours and hours waiting, as if at any moment his mother was going to walk through that door and take him home. The volunteers tried everything. They placed new toys around him, but he didn't look. They tried to bring him closer to other puppies to make him feel less alone, but he just moved away. They offered fragrant snacks, fresh food, but he wasn't interested. The only thing he was holding was that old, torn toy they found next to his mother's body. Each night he would bring it to the door and sit there in silence. It was as if he was waiting for a miracle that would never come. The days passed, and the concern grew. The puppy didn't get better. His body, which was already small and fragile, seemed even thinner. Sadness consumed everything in him. The volunteers knew that dogs could die from sadness. They had seen this happen before. Deep depression in an animal was like a hole that few could climb out of, but no one was willing to give up on him. And then, on a random day when no one else expected a change, something happened. It was a morning like any other. The shelter was full of barks. The other dogs were running, playing, eating. The volunteers followed their routines, cleaning, changing water, ensuring that each animal got a little attention. And there he was, in the usual corner, looking lost. That's when an older dog, rescued months before from a similar situation, approached. She had marks on her body, scars that told a story that no one wanted to hear, but unlike him, she had learned to trust again. She didn't smell it right away. He didn't try to play. She just lay next to him, as if she knew exactly what he needed. The cub glanced over. Something changed for a brief moment. She remained there. Hours later, he moved for the first time. A subtle, almost imperceptible movement. He leaned against her. For the first time since arriving, he allowed himself to feel the warmth of another being. And at that moment, without realizing it, he took the first step out of the darkness. From that day on, small changes began to happen. He still wasn't running. He still wasn't wagging his tail. He still wasn't playing like the others. But he stopped spending nights alone at the door. He started sharing space with the dog. He allowed a volunteer to touch him without backing down. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time there was hope, because perhaps he was beginning to understand that the love he lost could not be replaced, but that there was still love in the world for him. Love doesn't disappear. It can be crushed, ignored, bruised until there is almost nothing left, but it never disappears completely. Inside the heart of a puppy who lost everything, there was still a spark, small, weak, almost imperceptible, and no matter how much the world tried to turn off that light, it was still there. I just needed a reason to shine again. The puppy had already been at the shelter for weeks. His eyes, once empty and distant, had begun to change. It wasn't something immediate, it wasn't a sudden transformation, but little by little, something in him stirred. Since the day he leaned against that rescued dog, he no longer spent his nights alone at the door. He still held his dirty toy, but he no longer looked at it as much. He wasn't playing yet, but he started watching the other dogs running around, and sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he would move his little ears when he heard a more excited bark. He wanted to get out of that hole of sadness. I just didn't know how. It was then that she arrived. The volunteers already knew that dog, rescued months earlier from a horrific case of abuse. She was a survivor. His body still bore scars, permanent reminders of a life of pain. But somehow, despite everything, she had chosen to trust humans again. He wasn't the type to approach people in search of affection, but he also didn't move away. He walked through the shelter as if he understood that it was a safe place, as if he knew that his life had begun again there. And perhaps that was exactly what made her notice the puppy. That morning, while he was curled up in his usual corner, holding his toy, the dog just walked over. Not in a hurry, not with exaggerated curiosity. He just got closer, as if he already knew he should be there. The cub glanced over. His body instantly stiffened. I still didn't trust it. I still didn't know what to expect. But for the first time, he didn't move away. She lay down next to him just like the other dog had done before. He didn't try to force him to interact. It just stayed there. Time passed. The sun moved across the sky. The other dogs ran, the volunteers went about their routines, but the two remained in the same place, just breathing together, sharing a moment of silence that seemed to say more than any touch or words. Then, it happened. A sound so faint that almost no one heard it. A bark. It wasn't a strong, energetic bark, the kind a puppy lets out when he's happy. It was a low, hesitant bark, as if he was testing his voice after so long. The dog pricked up her ears. She looked at him, not with surprise, but with silent understanding. The cub stared at her for a moment. Then he let out a whimper like a shy, insecure request. And then he snuggled into her. The volunteers, who were watching from afar, held their breath. It was the first time he had done this. The first time he allowed himself to approach someone without fear. He finally accepted that he could love again. And in that moment, something inside him began to heal. Pain never completely disappears, but time can transform it. The cub, who arrived at the shelter as a shadow of what he should have been, now began to take his first steps away from the darkness. It wasn't a quick process, and no one expected it to be. Emotional scars don't heal overnight, and the fear he carried was too deep to be erased with simple acts of kindness. But something in him had changed. Something was different from the moment he snuggled up to that rescue dog. She became his anchor, his point of safety in that new world that still scared him. He still didn't trust humans completely, but by her side he felt protected. It was as if the mere fact of his presence meant that nothing bad could happen. The dog, in turn, seemed to understand this. I never forced him to do anything. It was just there, patiently waiting for him to take the next steps in his own time. And little by little, he started to give. The first sign came during a meal. Previously, volunteers had to leave the food and move away, as any human presence nearby would cause him to retreat. But that morning, as the other dogs ate, he looked at the plate in front of him and, for the first time, stepped forward without hesitation. His new mother was by his side, eating peacefully, and that seemed to give him courage. He lowered his snout and slowly began to eat too. It was a small, insignificant moment for those who didn't know its history, but for the volunteers who followed his fight from the beginning, it was a victory. Days passed, and small changes began to become more evident. He no longer spent his nights looking at the door. The dirty toy he never let go of was still always close by, but he no longer held it like it was the only thing he had left. Sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he allowed himself to explore the space around him. First, just a few steps. So I would sniff the floor, investigate a corner, watch the other dogs playing, until one day, without warning, something incredible happened. A ball rolled close to him. One of the shelter's most playful puppies was running around and ended up pushing the toy close to where he was. The cub looked at the ball. Then he looked around, as if to make sure no one was expecting anything from him. The silence was interrupted only by the excited barking of the other dogs, and then, as if something inside him was finally ready to try, he stepped forward. With his nose, he pushed the ball back. It was a light touch, shy, but real. The volunteers held their breath. The puppy played. For the first time, the reaction was almost immediate. The other dog ran to get the ball and brought it back to him. The cub hesitated for a second, but then pushed again. Shortly afterwards, he was already interacting for real. Still with some caution, still without the same energy as the other dogs, but he was no longer just watching life go by. His gaze, previously lost, began to shine again. Every day he showed himself a little more. He began to approach humans without so much fear. I already accepted. Snacks without needing to be convinced. He already allowed himself to receive affection without shrinking. It was no longer that puppy that sat in the corner, waiting for something that would never come back. He was there now, alive, and his new mother was still by his side. The two became inseparable. They slept together, ate together, walked around the shelter together. When one walked away, the other soon followed. She, a dog who also knew the cruelest side of humanity, seemed to have understood that he needed her. And he, a puppy who lost everything, found in her a reason to move on. Recovery was slow. Some nights were still difficult. Some days were more challenging than others. But the change was real. He was learning that the world wasn't just made of pain. He was discovering that there was still love for him. The end of a story is never really the end. Some remain within us, shape who we are, transform us in ways we don't always realize. The puppy that arrived at the shelter like a little ghost, unable to react, was now running around the space, playing with other dogs and accepting affection from humans without backing down. His recovery was slow, marked by small advances and setbacks, but finally, he was ready for a new chapter. The bond with his new mother was undeniable. The dog that welcomed him from the first moment never left him alone. They slept together, shared food, explored the shelter side by side. Where one went, the other followed. It was as if fate had decided to give him a second chance, bringing into his life someone who understood exactly what he felt. Separating them now would be impossible, and that's why the volunteers made a decision. They would not be put up for adoption separately. If they were going to have a home, it would have to be together. The public followed the story from the beginning. The shelter's social networks had shared every moment. The first time he ate alone, the day he touched a toy without fear, the night he slept against the dog for the first time. People from everywhere were sending messages, cheering, wanting to see that puppy find a family. And then, the day arrived. Among the many interested in adopting them, a couple caught the volunteers' attention. They had rescued dogs before. They knew what it was like to deal with trauma, with fears that don't disappear overnight. More than that, they didn't care about the fact that the puppy might never be a dog like the others. They understood that some wounds leave marks forever. The visit was exciting. The couple arrived at the shelter, sat on the floor and waited. They didn't force contact. They didn't call the puppy. They didn't try to gain its trust quickly. They just waited. And after a few minutes, he came to them. First, cautious, smelling from afar. Then he sat down next to the dog, watching them. And then, to everyone's surprise, he did something he had never done with a stranger. He laid his head on the woman's lap. The volunteers knew. He was the one who chose his family, and at that moment he had already decided. The process was quick. Within days, the two were ready to leave. When the car parked in front of the shelter to take them to their new home, a mix of emotion and anxiety took over everyone. The cub looked around, confused. For so long, that place was his only reference of safety. Now he was heading towards something unknown, but he wasn't alone. The dog jumped on the bench first, sat calmly, looking at him as if to say everything would be okay. He hesitated for a moment, looked at the volunteers as if trying to understand, and then, with a small impulse, jumped inside. The door closed. The car left. That story, which began with pain and abandonment, now followed a new path, but there was still something pending. Justice for those who could not speak for themselves. The man who abandoned the dog was convicted of mistreatment. The evidence was clear. The security camera images, the neighbors' testimonies, the dogs rescued on his property. He could no longer breed or trade animals. His name would be marked, and he would never have the chance to do it again. But was that enough? The volunteers knew that for that cub and its mother, justice came too late. They knew that nothing could erase the trauma, the pain, the moments of suffering he experienced. But maybe, just maybe, preventing this from happening to other dogs was the only way to give real meaning to what he went through. In the end, that cub didn't just survive. He changed everything around him, and now, finally, he had a home to call his own. The end of a story is never really the end. Some memories remain, some scars never disappear completely, and certain bonds, even interrupted by the cruelty of the world, continue to exist in some form. The cub, who was once found crying next to his mother's lifeless body, was now in a new chapter. He was no longer a little ghost stuck in the past. He no longer spent his nights waiting for someone to come back for him. He had a new chance, a new beginning. The couple who have followed his story since his rescue never had any doubts that he and his new mother were meant to be together. The bond between the two was undeniable. Separating them would have been like ripping off the last piece that still kept him standing. They needed each other, and now, finally, they would have a home where they could start over together. The ride to the new house was silent. The dog, ever protective, sat next to the pup, making sure he knew he was safe. He, in turn, remained quiet, observing everything around him, feeling the movement of the car, breathing in the new air that came in through the half-open window. There was something different in his gaze. There was still a trace of insecurity, but for the first time, there was also a glimmer of curiosity. When they arrived, the new owners opened the car door calmly, without rushing, without forcing them to get out. The dog was the first to go down, sniffing the ground, recognizing the territory. The cub waited. He looked at her, then at the couple. Then, with a little momentum, he jumped out of the car. The first steps were careful. The yard was spacious, with soft grass under his paws, a smell of wet earth and trees all around. Everything was new, different, but surprisingly, he didn't back down. Instead, he followed his new mother, walking slowly, exploring every corner of that place that, without him, knowing yet, was now his home. Inside the house, everything was already prepared. 2 bowls of food and water, a soft blanket, toys scattered on the floor. And in the corner of the room, side by side, 2 new beds, one for each person. The couple watched with a mix of emotion and anxiety. They wanted him to know he was safe, that that space now belonged to him. The dog, already used to changes, adapted quickly. He circulated around the room, looked around, and then lay down on his new bed, breathing deeply as if he finally understood that his difficult journey was over. But the puppy, he stopped in the middle of the room. He looked at his bed, then he looked around as if trying to understand what he should do. The owners didn't move. They just waited. They knew that every decision he made was important, that every choice was a small victory. And then, slowly, he walked to the bed. He smelled her first. He felt the texture of the fabric, experienced the space. Then he turned around and lay down. It was a simple but powerful moment. For the first time, he had a place that was his. For the first time, he lay down without needing to be alert. For the first time, I was not alone. The couple looked at each other, smiling. It was the end of a long journey, proof that he had won. But then something happened, a subtle movement, a small gesture that made the new owner's hearts tighten. The cub raised its head and looked around, as if looking for something. Then, with slow steps, he walked to the bag of belongings that the volunteers had sent along with him, and from inside it, with its small mouth, it pulled out an object, an old, dirty, torn toy, the same toy that was found next to his mother's body. He carried him gently to his new bed. He lay down and placed him between his paws, exactly as he did in the shelter, exactly as he did so many times when he was still waiting for something that would never come back. The owners felt a lump in their throat, because that toy wasn't just an object. He was the last connection that cub had to his past. He held it not out of sadness, but out of respect, for love, because some memories never fade. Some scars don't need to be erased. The couple approached and knelt beside him. Carefully, they patted his head. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and, for the first time, let out a long, peaceful sigh. He was at home. He was safe. And finally, he knew it. Stories like this remind us that, even after pain, there is always a new beginning. If this journey has touched you in any way, now you can be a part of it. Leave your like so that more people know this story, and comment "you won" in the comments to show that you believe in the strength of these little survivors. And believe me, this was just one of the incredible stories to come. The next video is already on the screen, and I guarantee it will move you even more. Press and keep watching.